Welcome to Blog Yin Yang, the Greater Result, podcast number 5, History's Synergies. This podcast is brought to you by History. Whatever you do today, whatever you see today, it is all built on the things that came before. History, you can't leave home without it. Sponsors, advertisers, wouldn't you like your name and company plugged during a podcast? It doesn't take much. Contact me at blogyinyang.com. And don't forget to visit the Blog Yin Yang shop and maybe get yourself a t-shirt or mug. Synergy is a wonderful thing. I was feeling pretty good about my podcast scheduling. I had one in the can and had an agreement with the next podcast guest. Unfortunately, the guest and I ran into scheduling conflicts. That left me with a hole that needed to be filled. I gave thought to allowing the time to pass. After all, I do not yet have any advertisers to appease. At this point, these podcasts are for my entertainment and enlightenment, while they do help fill the pockets of Google and other web servers. Anyway, I thought about just letting the time lapse, or perhaps I would do something like read a passage from a novel that I'm writing. Just as these thoughts were running through my mind, I received a request from Alex Saudam-Demande. Alex, please excuse me. I know I didn't get that right. I tried. I really did. He's a martial artist and chef that I have had occasion to train with. He asked me to consider a podcast on the history of the martial arts scene in Columbia, South Carolina. Synergy is a wonderful thing. When there is a hole, synergism often fills it. That said, history is not one of my strong suits. In fact, other than my social disabilities, it may be one of my weakest. But what the hell, it's worth a try, right? History of this nature is tricky. How far back do we go? What marks martial art history in Columbia, South Carolina? I mean, wouldn't the first codified martial art training eventually lead to Columbia as well as all other parts of the world? Clearly, some parameters need to be defined. For the purposes of this podcast, I will run back to the late 1960s, feeling that time frame will encompass most listeners' experiences. Certainly there is history before that, but finding useful information is difficult. Even with the sprawling internet, I ran into many Error 404s, links leading to dead ends of nothingness. Gathering real, useful information prior to the late 60s and early 70s is difficult, limited, and questionable. Additionally, I will use myself as a central thread. When talking about history, a single reference causes the discussion to branch outward. If you discuss Genghis Khan, you might mention that his father was poisoned by the Tartars. You could then run off talking about the Tartars, where you would find another reference that leads you further astray from the original discussion of Khan. All histories are like that. Using physics, we could call it the many worlds theory of history telling. In order to maintain a central reference point, I will use my limited martial arts encounters as anchors to pull me back toward a central line. All of that said, one of the beauties of podcasts and the internet is that interesting little box that is available to you below the podcast player. Yes, down there, called a comments box. Use it. If you know something that can fill in some of the gaps, take a moment and enter it. More information is better than less information. So, I have taken Alex's suggestion and completed a necessary lead-in. I now present Blog Yin Yang, the Greater Result, podcast number 5, History's Synergies. Blog Yang! In 1966, I was 10 years old. I had lived in Columbia, South Carolina for a little more than 1 year. About that same time, I began playing trumpet at the school I attended, Seven Oaks Middle School. Interestingly enough, that is where martial arts first faintly touched my life. Our band teacher was Mr. Levon Bazemore. In addition to teaching band, Mr. Bazemore was a black belt in karate. I guess we can say the history begins here, and like all beginnings, it is a shady, uncertain time. It was a long time ago, so my memory is questionable. I was young, so my retention and understanding is also questionable. I have pulled out my old yearbooks, but they, and even the lofty internet, are unwilling to cough up much useful information. I do not know what style of karate Mr. Bazemore studied, or where he studied, though I do know that it was karate and not jiu-jitsu or something like that. I do not know if he ever mentioned the style, though he did mention that he studied, at least to me and several other band members in my clique. I recall that we talked about it on several occasions. This was the first time I came to understand that martial arts were not restricted to movies and the TV. It was a real thing that could be learned by ordinary people, even here in Columbia, South Carolina. About 3 years later, on the bus ride home from junior high school, while still taking band under Mr. Bazemore, a friend of mine, Fred Friedberger, mentioned that he was studying a martial art and invited me to come along with him. I was quite intrigued. Suddenly the study of a martial art was something a kid could do with other kids and was not restricted to adults. Fred studied judo. One night I went with him to his judo class. I do not recall the instructor's name or the school's name. It was held in a little shop in a strip mall called Intersection Center, which is near Boozer Shopping Center. Intersection Center still stands. For those who know the area, Dutch Square did not yet exist, though it was in the planning stages. Next to Dutch Square is the Asian Market, which is near the entrance to Intersection Center. I guess the best landmark these days is the Hooters that is across the main road from the strip mall that I'm talking about. Anyway, I walked into one of those shops with my friend Fred. It was dingy, dreary, dirty, and sweat-stinky. Nothing at all like I imagined a shrine of martial arts to be. With the exception of Fred, all of the students were large men, and I mean large. As I did not own a gi, I was given the task of learning to fall, while big, grown, even overweight men were tossing each other all over the little room. As a very skinny, sickly 13-year-old, I left the experience feeling that judo was not for me. Beyond the raw strength and size that seemed to be required, the backroom appearance of the place, the quick pressure for fees and purchases, left me with a broken illusion. Around this time, karate was becoming big in the world at large. James Bond was taking down pussy galore with judo throws and whacking Odd Job with karate chops. Bruce Lee was on the big screen, and Kung Fu would soon appear on the TV. In 1971, I was 15. A band member friend of mine, Bobby Dobbins, informed me that he was taking karate and invited me to come along with him. Karate wasn't judo, so sure, maybe this was the hallowed hall I was looking for. Fortunately, the place of study was a few blocks from my house. Training took place at the home of Gary Shull, who should now be referred to as Sensei Shull, though at the time he was only a brown belt. The instructor was Sensei James Logue, who was a second-degree black belt in Okinawan Motobo-ryu. Sensei Logue examined me on that first meeting. We trained for 3 hours in Mr. Shull's mother's front and back yards. After that first day, Sensei Logue consented to take me as a student, which was indeed an honor, as he did not charge a cent. He trained who he chose to train, and no one else. Sensei Logue was the highest-ranking Caucasian in Okinawan Motobo-ryu at the time. He had been with the military, stationed in Okinawa, where he had studied under Seiyu Oyata, considered a master of Okinawan karate. When he began training with Sensei Oyata, Oyata did not speak any English. Sensei Logue struggled through, being persistent with his training for his entire term of duty, earning his second-degree black belt. When he returned to the States, he wanted to keep his training up. Somewhere, somehow, he met Gary Shull and began teaching him. I have some vague recollection that they had known each other before Sensei Logue went to Okinawa, but I can't be sure. I am sure I was told the story, but it has been lost in the musty crevices of my mind. To help paint the picture, Gary Shull's nickname was Beef. He was a big, young adult with excellent skills, and as I said, a brown belt. Bobby Dobbins was a thick, but not overweight, short individual. He had a green belt under Sensei Logue. It was during these years that Bobby got the nickname Brewster. Yes, he liked his beer, even though he was a little underage. I was the skinny, tiny, new kid. I wore a threadbare hand-me-down gi from Mr. Shull, which I still have to this day. We would train for 3 or 4 hours or more every Sunday, rain or shine. By age 17, I was the green belt, Brewster was the brown belt, Beef was a black belt, and another one of my band buddies was the noob. Training in a martial art had a certain mysticism. Sensei Logue instructed us to never wear our gis in public, and not to openly brag. In terms of self-defense, as long as we kept our training secret, we held an upper hand, an ace in the hole. We learned about respect and honor. And, of course, we were all in awe of Sensei Logue's skills. Beyond displaying his vast knowledge or simple tricks like board breaking, he would at times suddenly cut a standing flip effortlessly. How could a young, impressionable mind not be taken in? Training in Mrs. Shull's backyard or garage lent itself to that quiet, mystic secrecy. No signs, no badges, no banners. Every Sunday there was a silent migration of a small band of people who would then quietly learn skills and improve their physical abilities. This is the way it was back then. There weren't buildings with huge signs advertising martial arts, no TV ads. Sensei Logue's description of Seiyu Oyata's small, sparsely adorned cinder-block buildings set the example. Schools were little, nondescript shops and backyards. Like my entrances into judo and karate, you could only find your way in by invitation. It was the way the movies told us it should be. Even in Enter the Dragon, you had to receive a private request and then travel to a secret island. Around this time, we started to hear about other schools opening up in the area. The first name that came up was Ronnie Barcoot. I have been unable to find specific dates of when Barcoot opened his first school in Columbia, though it could not have been much before this time. Barcoot held quite a few properties and still has an apartment complex named after him in Columbia. At the time, style mixing was considered a no-no. It was disrespectful to your sensei and disrespectful to your art, though Bruce Lee was working on the West Coast to break those ideas. All we knew of Barcoot was that they were strongly tournament-based at the time. Like the Karate Kid, they were Cobra Kai to our Mr. Miyagi, though the Karate Kid would not hit the theaters for another decade. But having said that, I have to repeat, synergy and synchronicity are wonderful things. Looking back, the similarities are striking. We did not have a school building and trained in the backyard or garage. Tournaments were the least of Sensei Logue's concerns. Meanwhile, Barcoot had an official studio and was racking up considerable notice. On top of all that, Sensei Logue had thinning hair, a quaint mustache, and a very quiet demeanor. Other than the accent and the fact that Sensei Logue was a tall string bean, Mr. Miyagi could have been his twin. Do not misunderstand me. We didn't have any real problem with Barcoot or any other school. They were just a different school with a different approach. Overall, it was good that martial arts were growing, and we enjoyed being a part of that growth. But there was a sort of square peg and round hole feeling. They were different, and I'm sure they felt we were different. There was a brief discussion at one point about going to one of their tournaments, but Sensei Logue was not in favor of it. He felt that the techniques and style we used would not fare well due to the design of their rules. When we sparred, we used heavy headgear and chest protectors. Barcoot was using safety punch and safety kick, foam, hand, and foot pads. The kata were different. So he felt that it would be a square peg trying to fit into a heavily ruled round hole, resulting in more disappointment than improvement. In 1973 and 74, martial arts was growing in popularity. We got a few public demos at Boozer Shopping Center. As the popularity of things grow, wannabes begin to appear. Some of my students know a story I have about a wannabe self-taught, quote, third-degree black belt in Matobo-ryu, close quotes. He popped up at a vocational day at my high school. I promptly had to cut him down to size. Most of the cutting involved being knowledgeable and asking the right questions, though a demonstration did take place. But that is the way things go. When something is popular, everyone wants a piece. During these years, our training had moved to a little house that Sensei Logue had purchased not far from the Rush's Burger Joint down the road from Boozer Shopping Center. These were the shrine years for me. We trained all weekend long in many cases. At times we would sit on the floor of his living room and hear stories and learn mental concepts. I learned that the mysticism that often accompanies the martial arts is a real thing. In 1974, I graduated high school. Around this time, Sensei Logue, being a nuclear engineer, had moved to Barnwell, where a nuclear power plant was being built. My studies had to go on hiatus. Besides, college was looming ahead. In 1975, Mike Geneva opened a school in Columbia with a little fanfare and bravado. To my Kempo buds, it was just another Cobra Kai to have to deal with. As we were steeped in the idea that a martial art was a sacred, personal thing, the idea of brag and bluster was off-putting. We didn't realize that the future was staring us in the face. In that same year, I learned that Sensei Shull was teaching. He had managed an agreement with a church near Boozer Shopping Center. I attended several classes there, slowly growing my skills. In 1976, after a short break, I returned to college for a serious tour. But I did manage to spend some time traveling to Barnwell and Sensei Logue's school there. He finally had an official school building and was growing a class of students. It was much like I expected it would be. A little, nondescript, dim, hardwood, clean, sweet-smelling building, no boast or brag, just facts. I returned on several occasions until I was finally able to test for and achieve my brown belt. College was now my major focus. Then marriage arose, a child would be born, a marriage would dissolve. My martial art training was beyond a back burner. There was a life to build and live, but martial arts were in my blood and would surface again. Let me do a flash forward on Sensei Logue. He continued to train and study, often flying to Okinawa to train with Seiyu Oyata. In the latter 70s, early 80s, Oyata came to the United States. Martial arts are plagued with associations, leagues, and unfortunately politics. As soon as you attach money to something, often ethics, honor, and respect are sadly left behind. Seiyu Oyata eventually abandoned Matoboru. Or I guess it would be more accurate to say that due to political complaints and pressures from others, he disassociated himself from that particular league and associated himself with Shiriji Kempo. Oyata and Logue collaborated for years, indeed until Seiyu Oyata's passing. In the early 2000s, they both appeared on a Science Channel documentary series, Fight Science, where they talked more about pressure points than how to hit. Now back to the history. It was the late 1970s. The fitness craze was starting to kick into gear. Joggers could be seen even in the backwoods of Columbia, South Carolina. Martial arts schools were starting to pop up here and there. If we pull at the threads that have been laid down so far, we can find some interesting things. The Barkut School leads to Sensei Virgil Kimmy, Sensei Dewey Earwood, and Sensei Brian Penna. All of these are names I have heard over the years. I may have even met some of these people. Sensei Earwood is still teaching in Prosperity, South Carolina. Sensei Penna has lots of associations, including Gold's Gym, Ladies' Choice, and New Life Fitness. Sensei Ray Nash of American Tactical Jiu-Jitsu was a Barkut student as a child in the late 70s. He met Grandmaster Joe Hess in the early 80s, who suggested he go to Geneva's school. There he trained with Joey Shiflett, and from there he went to the Columbia School of Karate-Do, where he trained under Hanshi Ridgely Abel. It is sort of like a game of 7 degrees to Kevin Bacon. Barkut leads to Sensei Nash, which leads to Hanshi Abel, who leads to Sifu Mark Mills, which will eventually lead back to me. Hey, only 5 steps. You can play this game going inward or outward. I lead to Sifu Mark Mills, which leads to Sifu Francis Fong, which leads to Guru Dana Santo, which leads to Bruce Lee. No matter how you look at it, the circle of martial arts was small at the time and still maintains a degree of centrality. Mark Mills trained at the Columbia School of Karate-Do under Hanshi Abel in the mid-1970s. Much like myself, he took a life break and returned in the 1980s. In 1988, he earned a black belt in karate under Sensei Michael Guy and a black belt in Shinto Yoshin Ryu Jiu-Jitsu under Hanshi Abel. His training for these black belts would be during the same years that Sensei Nash, formerly of the Barkhoot and Geneva schools, was there. And Synergy strikes again. In that same year, 1988, my child, Alex, was born. Shortly after Alex's birth, I was asked to leave, so a divorce followed, but that is another story. Martial arts were slowly changing. Bruce Lee had opened the door to cross-training. Sensei Nash was a good example of that, having switched across several styles and schools. In a way, Sensei Logue and Seiyu Oyata had led the trend as well, switching associations and branching out their training to other martial art considerations. It was no longer a no-no to switch styles. In fact, it was becoming a requirement to be as diverse as possible. While things were becoming diverse, there was also some prevalence. Taekwondo seemed to be a fairly common art. The Motobo-Ryu style I studied was a form of Kempo, a hard-hand, large-stance style. It did not blend well with the high-spinning kicks of the TKD folk. TKD often lent itself to tournaments. TKD schools were becoming more prominent and noticeable. The South Carolina Boxing Commission had pretty much clamped down on boxing and other expositions during the 1970s, to the point that such things were non-existent during the 80s and 90s. Not even legitimate boxing or WWE, back then WWF, style wrestling was allowed in a public forum. Expos, demos, and low-impact tournaments were all that were really available in the area. Some of these expos and tournaments were fairly common, especially with the nationally and internationally associated schools such as Barkhoot and Geneva. Their arts, having a larger association, availed them to tournaments in other states and helped them to produce tournaments in the Columbia area. I was only vaguely aware of these, but I do know they were out there. In fact, during the late 1980s, while I had lost connection with Sensei Logue, one of my band buddies, Jerry Long, was still with him and had progressed quite far. Due to a variety of changes that had taken place, Sensei Logue and his students had begun to attend these types of tournaments, partly because the rules had changed and partly because Sensei Logue had taken the rules into consideration. At one such tournament, my friend Jerry, while sparring and throwing a particularly strong side kick, happened to get his big toe caught in the leg of his gi pants, ripping his big toe off, literally. Maybe they should have stayed with safety punch and safety kick. In 1993, the first UFC was held. Global and national events changed local events. Around this same time, Mr. Mark Mills was exposed to Sifu Francis Fong at a seminar which sent him on the path of wanting to learn more about Wing Chun, Jeet Kune Do, and Kali, following that idea of becoming diverse. Around 1995, Sifu Mills began teaching in a small building on US 1 in West Columbia. He also began making regular visits to Atlanta, Georgia to train at the Francis Fong Academy, as well as attending regular seminars and making trips to California to train under Guru Dana Nisanto. In addition to Wing Chun, JKD, and Kali, he began adding Muay Thai and BJJ to his playbook. Around 1997, he moved his school into the small Oak Grove business complex, still off US 1, in West Columbia. Martial arts were growing wildly at this time. Schools were everywhere. Geneva's was still in business. I suspect that Barkhoot was too, but I cannot say for sure. I suspect that Billy Purvis's Life Force started around this time, but I don't have any real information there. Columbia Karate-Do was still strong. Hanshi Abel held yearly expos, which Sifu Mills often attended. There were Kims and Tigers and more schools than a person could shake a stick at. Trying to track all of them would be an impossible task. There were as many fly-by-night as stayed tried and true. New arts were evolving, such as Jeet Kune Do, Vale Tudo, and the concept of mixed martial arts, as well as old arts being given new prominence, such as Jiu-Jitsu and BJJ, and even some eccentric arts like Wing Chun, Capoeira, and Kali or Screama. In 1997, the year Sifu Mills moved into the Oak Grove complex, my child, Alex, was 9. Alex is my guest in a previous podcast, podcast number 4. Alex's mother decided that Alex should take martial arts, specifically the style that Bruce Lee was known for, Jeet Kune Do. Synergy strikes again, for it was at almost the same age that I had first been touched by the martial arts, and that desire for JKD would have me meet Sifu Mills. There was a hitch. There was only one school in the area that taught JKD. It was Columbia Martial Arts Training Center, headed by Sifu Mark Mills. However, Sifu Mills did not teach children. Alex's mom called a few times, but was always told, "Sorry, we do not teach children." Finally, she called and asked the right question. If you don't teach children, then what should Alex take to be ready for Jeet Kune Do when Alex is old enough? Sifu Mills caved and suggested that we bring Alex in. Despite the divorce, I spent time with Alex every single day. That was the agreement that I fought for. Well, the classes were in the evening, and that was my visit time with Alex. So it became routine for me to take Alex to martial art classes. The building was reminiscent of the old days. There was a sign, but not an imposing one. The room was clean, even if the walls weren't painted or finished, beams and girders plainly evident. The classes were small and focused. It was difficult for me, with a fair amount of martial art experience, to sit there and watch Alex struggle with some of the skills. I would often squirm in the chair, mimicking the moves, as if I could kinetically assist Alex from a distance. After about 2 weeks of this, Sifu Mills suggested that I just step in and work with Alex, which would free him up to focus on the other adult students. It was not long, perhaps a matter of weeks, before I was assisting Sifu Mills with the classes in general. I had Kempo habits that needed to be modified, but I seemed to have retained many of my skills. And within several months, another child came into the school, providing Alex an age-appropriate partner to work with, which in turn put me deeper into the adult classes. Kids are kids. They grow and change quickly. I cannot say that Alex lost interest in martial arts, but Alex did lose interest in attending classes. I was deep in at the time, assisting with teaching as well as learning. In 1998, Sifu Mills received instructor rank in Muay Thai under Master Chai. In 1999, Sifu Mills was inducted into instructor programs under both Sifu Fong and Guru Inasanto. It was the early 2000s. The UFC was blowing up. Sifu Mills and I attended Sifu Fong and Guru Inasanto's seminars regularly. In addition, seminars with Fong and Inasanto, as well as renowned folk like Eric Paulson, Fred Shamrock, Higan Machado, and Larry Hartzell, were often held at Columbia Martial Arts Training Center. Expos were common at the time. Hanshi Abel's expos were big affairs in the area. Often Sifu Mills and I would attend and give demos or instructions in Wing Chun. One such weekend-long expo was held at the Marriott downtown and took up all of their meeting rooms. By the mid-2000s, I was inducted into the Wing Chun instructor program under Sifu Fong. The South Carolina Boxing Commission was being pressured to allow some form of paid events to take place. UFC was making it clear there was money to be made. Through much wrangling, an event was finally allowed to take place at Township Auditorium in downtown Columbia. Another Columbia Martial Arts Training Center student, Jeff Ingold, and I were asked to do an exposition in which I played the chicken who fled the ring. The intent was to generate a rematch. Unfortunately, the attendance was really poor. The promoters lost their shirt on the deal, probably as much to poor planning and poor advertising as anything else. There would not be another such event in the Columbia area for almost a decade. All through the early 2000s and to this present day, Sifu Mills has conducted biannual grappling tournaments, biannual meaning twice each year, spring and fall. The first ones were rather small, but it has grown into a huge event, often with close to 200 contestants. In 2007, Sifu Mills built a facility and made the transition from being an evening-only instructor holding down another job to a full-time dedicated martial arts instructor, including a huge kids program. This was a big change from the early days when he did not teach children at all, and he was not solely dependent on his martial art proceeds for a living. Martial arts schools stayed, came, and went. I know of several poorly managed schools that crept in and then vanished, as well as other schools that did well and continue to grow. Martial arts schools were changing, however. Kids were becoming prominent on one hand, while MMA was becoming a dominator on the other. Mixing MMA and kids is a weird thing. School franchises from outside the state were moving in. This is not to say that there weren't some art-oriented and art-specific schools. When things flourish, anything becomes possible. However, competition was becoming and still remains fierce. The old days were ending. In 2008 or 2009, the South Carolina Boxing Commission finally relaxed the rules and allowed paid, promoted mixed martial arts events to take place. There were a few quick upstarts that didn't do so well, but Sifu Mills and promoter Sam King got together and created Caged Chaos Columbia. They have put together 8 events since then, most of which have been sellouts. These are difficult and expensive events to put together. Fighters must pass medical exams, there are promotion restrictions, venue requirements, and huge fees to the Boxing Commission. Everyone involved makes a buck, often leaving the event organizers holding only a few cents. There was a time, sometime after Cage Chaos 4 or 5, that Sifu Mills and Sam King had thought about folding it up. A few other upstarts threw some horribly managed events, leading the Boxing Commission to ask that Caged Chaos be revived, it being the best organized and run events of their type in the area. So that is where we are today. I know I have left out dozens of schools and styles. I know former students of Columbia Martial Arts that have built their own reasonably successful schools. I know of students that have gone to other schools to become highly ranked in non-related arts. As I stated at the beginning, histories are a many worlds formula, with limbs, branches, twigs, and leaves by the thousands. It is not possible to cover everything. A study of martial art histories suggests that our modern concept of the arts began sometime in the early 20th century. It was only at that time, as societies were becoming less agrarian and individuals had more free time and free money, that schools as we understand them today began to appear. Until that time, training was much like I had experienced, in someone's backyard, or more likely in a military school. As schools developed, it was necessary for them to take on business practices. Many B-ranked kung fu films are full of tales of one school battling with another school for dominance, all couched in the ideas of style supremacy or insult to one's master. But it is really about eliminating the competition and cornering the local market. So, in 1966, when I was first touched by the arts, martial arts schools were still a fledgling industry, barely half a century old. Where once a martial arts school was about a specific art, with classes running for hours, where a school might focus on sports sparring or tournaments or kata, or where the teacher might open up his home and teach only a select few, now schools have become businesses. They tout lineages, but do not necessarily hold to them. Often a lineage is a marketing pitch. If MMA is big, they gear toward MMA. If BJJ seems big, they quickly throw in a grappling program. If Muay Thai is mentioned by a UFC champion, suddenly everyone is doing Muay Thai. Over all of that is the growing fitness craze, which the martial arts have jumped into headlong. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was talk of McDojos and black belt factories, businesses designed to deliver martial arts rather than schools that became a business. It may be that it is unavoidable and that the old way cannot survive in modern times. Few people want to work 2 jobs as the old martial art instructors had to do. Few modern jobs provide the kind of security and leeway or time that the old instructors relied upon in order to be able to teach on the side with regularity. The heavy competition load requires marketing and business techniques to pack as many people into the place as possible. The Barkoots, the Genevas, and the Kims all saw that coming. Kid programs, often little more than daycare, pop in to help with cash flow. Instead of 3 or 4 hour classes are shortened to an hour or less so you can run another crowd of customers through. Once there was a degree of humility. You kept your secret. Now students are asked to proudly fly their colors and boast. It is good advertising for the school. Surviving with 25 or 50 students isn't possible. 200 or 300 or more become the target. Games, rapid advancement, events, anything one can contrive to bring in more customers becomes as important as the art itself. Sometimes the better schools are the better businesses and not necessarily the better product. The shrine days, the mysticism have faded away. It is no longer possible to elect to focus on an item such as a kata for an extended period. With the need to provide ranking at a noticeable pace, many schools have to teach to the test rather than testing what was learned. There is a need to keep an eye open to the next big thing and to bend to it, such as MMA, which is something that I consider to be an extreme subset of the martial arts, and forces as much time to be spent on sport, strength training, endurance, and raw physical fitness as is spent on technique and other related art, science, and skill. It is a different world from the one I looked for and found in the early 1970s. I'm not saying it is a bad world, it is just a different one. The pressures from outside, the life and business that America and the world as a whole have created, have sucked away some of the hallowed nature of the arts as I first envisioned and found them. To keep pace, to make more, even hobbies and personal pleasures have become items on a factory conveyor belt, licked, stamped, and moved through as quickly as possible. The money is in the numbers. This does not mean that the individual cannot find or create those calming, learning, and expanding experiences. They are not on a shelf to be handed to you by a person behind the counter. They must be sought around the school, both in and outside of it. Well, there you have it. If you liked what you heard, please share it. And please visit the blog Yin Yang Shop and leave a comment for a change. Thanks for listening. Blog Yin Yang.